gremlins! I've decided to redraw some more of my old art, and this time the old art isn't digital. While I have been doing digital art in some form since I was about 3 years old, for most of my life my primary medium was colored pencils, with graphite outlines and occasionally some pen if I was feeling fancy. It will not surprise you at all to know I was very into fairies as a child. I drew a lot of fairies, sometimes ones from magical otherworlds and sometimes fairies who exist in the real world. The fairy in this drawing is from the second category. She's wearing a trumpet flower as a dress and is hanging out by a pond near a dandelion, which shows her scale. This drawing is also a landscape drawing, but for the redraw I decided to draw it vertically instead. Most of the focus of the drawing is on the fairy and the dandelion, and most of the rest of the page is just filled in messily with blue pond water and blue sky. It can be cropped out without consequence. Before I even started recording my redraw, I spent a while gathering reference images. Water is still really tricky for me to draw, so I have a lot of photos of the edges of ponds. I also have a couple reference images each of dandelions and trumpet flowers. I changed the fairy's pose slightly. In the original, she's holding a drop of water in both hands, and has one foot just touching the surface of the water, making ripples. Her center of weight isn't well balanced at all, and it looks like she's about to tip face forward into the water. It also completely disconnects her from the dandelion. It's just two large objects in the same area with no interaction. In my redraw, I kept the element of reaching out over the water and the fairy's foot touching the surface of the pond. However, instead of both hands clasped in front of her holding a droplet, she has one hand around the stalk of the dandelion for balance, and the other hand stretched out over the water empty. I do end up adding the motif of water droplets into the drawing again much later, as dewdrops on the blades of grass around the fairy. Figuring out the pose of her legs specifically was quite difficult. I couldn't figure out which leg should be touching the water, and then I couldn't figure out how to pose her foot on land. I redrew the back leg especially a lot, to make it look semi-decent. Unlike many of my redraws, where I completely redesigned the characters present, I kept this fairy's look pretty much the same. She still has a trumpet flower dress, although one I drew based on actual images of trumpet flowers rather than from memory. Her hair is still in a messy ponytail with bangs. The only things I redesigned were her wings, which now have insect wing-like segments, and the only thing I added are leg wraps around her calves to add a bit more detail to her outfit. I did change a lot about the background though. The sky isn't visible at all, just the pond stretching out behind the fairy and the far bank near the top of the page. She's standing on a little peninsula of land, which the pond wraps around. There are a few lily pads in the water, and both the land the fairy is standing on and the bank in the background are growing with grass and dandelions. I also added some clover around the fairy's feet to fill in space with a green plant that fits the tiny scale of the drawing. The background is where most of the glow-up for this image comes from. Well, that and the anatomy and pose of the fairy. Unlike many of my childhood drawings, this character isn't an original character TM of mine, and if there was an imaginary game connected to her, it's been long since forgotten. Most likely, she's just a random fairy I decided to draw, based on other drawings of fairies wearing flowers of clothing. I chose the trumpet flower both because it looks like a skirt already, and because trumpet flowers, or at least a flower I think was a trumpet flower, grew beside our house. Fairies and dinosaurs were my big obsessions growing up. When I was really little, I thought I was part fairy, and later I used to pretend I was the lost daughter of the fairy queen, who'd been sent to the human world for my safety. I then, of course, find a portal to fairyland where I meet my fairy twin sister and fairy cousin, and we go on adventures in both worlds. That fairy twin sister and cousin were my two most consistent imaginary friends growing up. I also had a fairy garden for a while as a kid, a patch of the yard set up with logs and flower pots that had little clay doors. The homes were connected with stone paths, and I'd spend hours playing at setting up the fairy city, adding attractions and hiking trails and signs, making little boats and bridges for the fairies to cross the drain, or just sitting still to wait for the fairies that lived there to be brave enough to come out of hiding. Sadly, they never did. I dressed up as a fairy a lot too. I used to have a pair of sparkly blue fairy wings, and I'd use construction paper to make myself leaf skirts. Finally, I draw fairies a lot. This is just one example that I've kept all these years, and I'm sure there are others I've kept in various folders and sketchbooks, which I'll stumble across again one day. Unfortunately, the photo I took of this art really darkened all the colors, so I couldn't just color pick from my original art. I did, however, base all the colors in the foreground off the original colors. I did adjust the fairy's skin tone a bit to be less orange, but that's all. I did change the colors of the background though, as the pond would be more likely to be dark green rather than bright blue, and once again the sky isn't visible at all. The only element of the background to have outlines is the dandelion, because the outlined character is directly interacting with it. As a bit of a transition between the black outlines of the fairy character and the background which has no outlines, the dandelion's outlines are colored. I also used a star-shaped brush for the dandelion fuzz, which worked really well. Drawing the fairy character was pretty easy. It's an interesting pose, but not a difficult one, other than the legs, and I didn't change her design much. Most of the challenge of this art was in the background, which was quite intimidating to draw, since drawing water is still one of my weaknesses. I ended up procrastinating the background by drawing a bunch of fan art, which I think should be posted on my Instagram by now, although I haven't posted it yet at the time of writing the script. I finally was able to start the background though, and once I got going, it was okay. I worked in sections: the land the fairy is standing on, the far bank, and then the pond. I started by adding blocks of color where each element would be, saving all the details and texture for later. I did make it so a bit of land is visible through the water, although fading from sight as it gets deeper, although by the time I'm done, that gets lost beneath the ripples and reflections. The blades of grass around the fairy were easy. The clovers were a bit trickier, not the drawing of them, but the shading of them. Near the far bank, there's a rock island textured with a bit of green moss or maybe algae. The far bank is growing with long grass, although I had to shrink the grass to make the bank look further away. There's also a single dandelion among the grass, this one with both a puff of white and a yellow flower remaining. As I got started with the detail and texturing, I expanded my canvas to include room for all my pond reference photos, without covering up any of the art I was working on. I had an idea for another detail to add while I was shading the foreground blades of grass, and I tried to draw dewdrops digitally for the first time. Making a black circle, then adding white highlights before making the entire layer a screen layer to make all the black invisible, worked really well to create reflecting water drops. Adding a small shadow each one on the grass just tied it all together. The clover proved easier to shade than I thought it would be when I first drew it. I guess growing up with a yard full of it and spending a lot of time looking at it helped. Adding a little bit of white around where the leaves attached to the stem really made them look like clover. It isn't a particularly detailed shading, but all these little details really help make this image look like it really is set in nature. I even drew a single four-leafed clover for fun. The last of the foreground details was the dandelion, which I added just enough shading to keep it from looking flat, before moving on to the lily pads and the far bank. As you can see, I procrastinated the water for last. Most of the far bank is just textured with dirt and some default grass brushes. I also shaded the dandelions and shrubbery behind them. I am a bit worried that the dandelion fluff in the background is too white and eye-catching given it's supposed to be in the backdrop. Finally, I got started on the water. My first step was to add rippling light, like how light and shadows look like on the bottom of a pool, or in this case, on a pond bed. These light patches won't be very visible by the end, but they add a nice subtle detail. Basically, I drew a bunch of wonky ovals connected by their outlines, getting smaller the further away they are. I then added a second layer of a slightly different shade, making the ovals overlap. I blurred both layers and made them both transparent. Next, I began to work on the reflections. My method of drawing reflections is to make a copy of the land above the water, merge it all into one layer, and then flip it upside down and warp it slightly until it looks like it's reflected on the rippling surface of a pond. It's quite easy to do digitally, and makes the water look so good. I did one layer of reflection for the far bank and a separate reflection for the land the fairy is standing on. I did forget to make the reflection of her foot over the water, though. Perhaps fairies, like vampires, don't show reflections. That's not true, but I'm going to say it is for the purposes of this drawing only. Finally, I added some round ripples emanating from the fairy's foot, and some shadows under the lily pads, and I was able to remove all my pond reference images and start shading the fairy herself. I started by recoloring her wings, since while my original image gave her white/silver wings, the new insect-like look of her wings looks better in brown. I don't think I pushed the shading on this character as much as I should have. After all the effort I put into the background, I think she ends up looking a little flat, and I might go back and up the contrast on her shadows later. I struggled with shading her skin, mostly because of the direction the light is coming from. Looking back at the speed draw while I was writing the script, I realized that I backlit her legs, and only her legs, where I should have made the edges of her legs in shadow and the middle in light, since the light would be coming from the front. I'm just so used to shading where one edge of the limb is lighter than the other, and I got confused. I definitely need to fix the shading when I have time and energy. Moving on from the skin, I added white tips to the fairy's yellow trumpet flower skirt, mirroring the coloring of my original image. I then shaded her hair, a process that went way better than shading her skin did. Finally, I got to work on the overall shadows of her body, and reinforced the backlighting on her legs. Yikes. Maybe it's a good thing I made the shadows too light in the end, at least it makes the leg shadows look less obvious. I finished the drawing by adding some vignette around the edges, as I often do, and a hint of light at the center of the image, around the fairy's face. And I've decided that before I publish this image, I've got to fix the damn shading. So we are back to the drawing again, nearly a week after I thought I'd finished, to fix this mess. I started my touch-up by completely removing all the shading on the legs, as well as the torso, which, since I'm fixing this anyway, I think could be better. I then started reshading the skin, this time keeping the edges of the leg in shadow and the middle of the leg in light, which looks so much better already. I added my shadow layer back in and added the final touches of some mud to the fairy's feet and legs, which I forgot to add before, which really makes her feel part of the muddy pond environment. It didn't take long to fix it all, only about 10 minutes, but it was so worth it and I'm glad I did. Now, the drawing is actually done. Here's the original image I drew about 10 years ago, I don't remember exactly. And here is my redraw. I am super happy with it, I think the background looks incredible, and I like the way I've drawn the fairy, keeping the original design but elevating it. I hope you enjoyed watching me update my old art. I love making these kind of videos. See you all in 2 weeks, and until then, bye! And I tried to draw dewdrop. And I tried to draw dewdrops for and I tried to draw. This is a really hard sentence to say.